Today, we're going to be looking at the lessons for the second Sunday, or I'm sorry, not the second, the third Sunday in Lent. It's hard to think that when we get to the third Sunday in Lent, we're 1/3 of the way through the season already. I have a hard time wrapping my head around what Sunday we're on, because it just seems to be like a fast flowing river, say that 3 times fast, at this hour of the day. And it's just all sort of moving so quickly that I think part of it also is the headspace that we get into at church and leadership, because we're always thinking ahead. So that this morning, for example, I was already putting stuff up for next week, which is the 3rd week in Lent. And then once that's done, then we turn our sights onto the 4th Sunday in Lent, which is, we are more than halfway through. Well, on the 4th Sunday, we are exactly halfway through in terms of days. And the fact that we are looking for the next 2 weeks at church at a sort of limited teaching opportunity from the scriptural point of view, because Mary and I have decided that we will use this, excuse me. Oh, okay. We will use this time for an instructed Eucharist, which, when I went back into my memory banks, we have not done at St. Luke's for 6 years. It's been 6 years since the last one. And I remember the last one that we did, which was when I first arrived and I was the interim, that we did one, and everyone really, really thought it was beneficial. They enjoyed it. They learned a lot, and they said, can we do this again more frequently? And I said, sure, not realizing it would be 6 years before we did it again. And the reason we decided, it was sort of not originally planned as part of our Lenten observance, but because of various reasons, we had to cancel one of our formation sessions with our candidates for confirmation and reception. But this is such an important piece that we were trying to figure out, well, should we bring them in on another day or another time? And then it just dawned on me that, we hadn't had this opportunity for such a long time. And Lent is a perfect time to do this, because particularly in the middle of Lent, while we begin to, by the time we finish and we're on the 4th Sunday, we begin to turn our focus toward Holy Week and the meditation on the events of that time. And that the Eucharist is meant in the Christian community, in the long tradition of the church, to be a fundamental remembrance of that core. Oops, I just blew a fuse. So now I'm on battery power. So if you'll excuse me I didn't blow a fuse, but I have a heater on, and it was a bit much for the thing. I'll be right back. If you just give me one break.
Oh my.
Oh, modern technology.
At least you knew what was wrong. A damp day at the shore is cold.
I really appreciate what you have done soon of sending us a reminder. But this morning I woke up and did not even realize what day it was. And your message reminded me. Oh boy.
You're welcome. I'm sure that Father David wants us all to go to the St. Luke's Lebanon website and explore around there. I suspect it annoys him if he is really aware that I do this, but I can't cope with all that stuff in the morning sometimes. Carmen, you went away. We lost you. Wow.
I'm sure she'll be back.
I'm sure she'll be back. She's good.
Is she clergy?
Pardon me?
Is Carmen clergy? Is she ordained?
I don't know, actually. She and her partner, Diane, I think are, and they maybe they both are. I think Diane is. She's from Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
and they moved here from Tennessee, and they're something like Methodist. I'm not sure. She
Yes,
could-
actually,
No.
I'm back.
Hi.
It wasn't the main breaker. It was the one that I've got everything else plugged into. Okay, so actually, yes, Carmen, they're talking about you in your absence.
Uh-oh.
Yes, Carmen and Diana are both ordained Methodist ministers. So turn some lights back on here. There we go. See, now I can see. We don't have the story of Jesus healing, but or at least not healing the blind man, which is another year of the cycle during this time. But here we go. So we're back to Carmen. We don't see your lovely face today. Is that by design?
I know, I know. I'm having trouble and I don't know. I need to go back to the settings.
Oh,
That's what
okay.
I think. So
Okay.
I might
right.
disconnect if I do.
Well, then come back to us quickly. We'll talk about you some more in your absence if you.
Oh, that's what I am afraid of.
Okay. I'll see. We're just everyday people here. See, that's what happens with everyday people. I also heard you as I was coming back into the room. You were saying that Father David doesn't like it when. And I didn't quite hear the rest of it.
I was saying, I send out a reminder and I copy the information on how to get here
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah.
onto email. And I what I said was, I thought you probably really wanted us to go and poke around St. Luke's Lebanon.org to get it and be more comfortable doing that. But in the morning
Yeah.
when I'm trying to get this done, it helps to just push a button.
You're
Yeah.
right. That would be my preference, but my bottom line is always the outcome, and the outcome is to have you all here. So that's how
Right.
you get here makes no difference to me.
Well, and what I was saying to her was, thank you very much for the reminder, because this morning, when I look at the email, I realized, oh, it's Thursday.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. Well, and I'm getting, as I mentioned, I am at the shore. I'm getting back in the habit as the weather gets nicer, because I can do most of the end of the week work that I do. And Friday is supposed to be my day off. That I am trying to spend more time down here, just to kind of for my spirit too. It gives me some time alone. You know, it's sort of a mini retreat every week, which is good for me. We're going to look today at the gospel lesson, but that's not what we're going to be talking about on Sunday. I started talking about the instructed Eucharist. The homily on Sunday will be quite brief, and this is the designated week for Mother Mary to preach. So she is going to be talking about the first lesson, but we're not. So, you know, I would advise that you look at the first lesson prior to services on the weekend. But the bottom line is, the reason I say that is because it's not going to be kind of normative for the next 2 weeks. This week, we do cover the first part of the Eucharist. We divided it up just like we did last time, that this will be the liturgy of the word, the beginning part of the prayer book Eucharist on Sunday. So we will do the instructed piece from the beginning until just after the peace, just before the offertory. And then next week, we'll start with the offertory and go through the rest of the service. So the idea is originally that this is what we were going to do with the candidates for confirmation and reception. But we're going to incorporate the whole parish in it this time, as we did 6 years ago. So I think we're all looking forward to it. We had some experience then as how to best to present it, and we're going to go forward. And you got a twofer this time. You got 2 people doing it as opposed to 1. So we're mapping out exactly how we're going to do that. So just to kind of let you know what's going on. So let's go on our journey as soon, once us is concerned for me not to do, but we're going to do it anyway. This is how we get to our website here. Let's see. So I'm going to go to home, which is, I believe, yes, that's our St. Luke's Lebanon.org. That's, what Soon was talking about earlier. And then we can always go over here to the lessons for this Sunday. And there's 2 links here. They're both the same usually. So we just go to lessons for this Sunday, and that should bring up the page on our Christian Formation website, which is just that. It's the lectionary text for Sunday. And here we have the readings for Lent, for the 3rd Sunday in Lent. You can download the PDF for it by clicking on this link here, and that will give you a copy that you can look at again or print or go back to this page. The first lesson is what Mother Mary wants to talk about this Sunday, and that is a lesson from the book of Exodus early on. It is the call of Moses, and there's an interesting dimension to this reading. I just want to point out a couple of things there. That Moses, we get this notion that whenever God is talking to us, that it's easy for us to respond, and that we just immediately respond. That's the right way of doing it, is that God says something to you, do it. That's not the testimony of the scriptures. The scriptures don't do that. I mean, most of the key people that God calls into mission do not go willingly, or they don't go without first asking a whole lot of questions. So, for example, we have this early on example of Moses, and he comes up with all kinds of things. It's like, I'm not a good speaker. How am I going to rally the people? I don't know who you are. How do I tell the people that, this God I'm encountering here is sending me? What name do I give you? And so on. So, there's always this sort of reticence on the part of anyone who is called into a deep part of God's mission. Later on in scripture, we see that with the various calls of the prophets. We did study that just about a month ago or so with the call of Isaiah. And I think that's the last time Mother Mary preached. And you may remember that sermon where, Isaiah was very reticent. He said, I'm a man of unclean lips. I mean, nobody's going to listen to me. They look at my life and they say, who does he think he is? And basically, then we have the whole purification of, the flaming brazier coming from the heaven and touching the lips of Isaiah and so on, all that imagery. We all know the story of Jonah. The whole Jonah and the whale, that seems to be, a story, or the big fish, whatever you want to call it. That's a story we like to tell, but we forget that the whole reason for that was Jonah fought with God. Jonah said, not on your life, I'm not doing this. And, he went on a trip, and he got tossed overboard because the sailors thought he was a bad omen. And then he gets swallowed up by the fish, and the fish delivers him. And, there's all kinds of imagery there. He spent 3 days in the belly of the we'll call it a whale, in the belly of the whale. None of that is physical. I mean, if you spent 3 days in the belly of a big mammal like a whale, you would not survive. But, and then he's regurgitated, as it were, up onto the seashore. And there's a lovely way of preaching about that, where you really just sort of graphically figure out what his experience might have been at that moment, what he would have looked like and smelled like, and all kinds of things, and that when we're called into mission, that those are the things that happen to us, that, most of us do not go willingly into these high callings, because if we know anything about this world, or we know anything about human nature, we soon discover, if we didn't know already, how resistant people are to the call of God, not just individually, like in the case of these prophets that I'm talking about, but rather in the whole idea of listening to what they have to say, particularly when it's not a happy message. I can share with you personally, for example, currently, as I listen, I am a news junkie, as most of you already know. And when I listen to the reports coming from Ukraine, and I watch not so much just the news reports per se, the informational part, but when they get the interviews of the parliamentarians and so on, and there are a few spokespersons who speak very good English, and they have tended to be women, and they make this pleading, I just have to turn it off. I can't bear to hear it anymore, particularly since they're asking for things which, in the cold analysis of international relations and so on, I think we're doing the right thing, but it's not the one thing that is tugging at our heart or our gut. And that's that internal struggle that I am personally having with that is, I think, emblematic of the kind of struggle that people have when they hear prophetic voices, where the prophetic voice is calling us, Moses, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. These days during Lent, we hear a lot from Jeremiah, Jonah, Amos, Micah, Zephaniah, all the rest of them, all of the prophets of the Old Testament are calling ancient Israel back to a right relationship with God relative to the living out of the law. The law meaning the Torah, the law of Moses, a way of conducting our lives, this ethical way of conducting our lives. And when it exacts a high cost, it makes us uncomfortable. And I think that maybe some of the discomfort we feel in our current situation is just that. So really what it is calling us to is a careful examination of our moral values and what price we are willing to pay relative to those moral values. Now, we can do that as individuals, but we also do that as a people. And I think that's where our biggest disconnect is coming currently, in that when we talk about it as the call coming to us and our internal struggle individually, we feel helpless because what can I do? We can throw up our hands and say, what can I do? I can send money, I can support them, I can pray for them, I can do all that. But, we don't think of ourselves often as a singular community, even though we can differ a great deal, as I've said before, in policy questions and so on. We have a hard time seeing ourselves as community within even our own parish, much less the wider church. And then when you stop to think about us as a nation, as a society, and how divided we really are, and how much is that division really rooted in a sense of value, or is it rooted in some larger sense of self-interest? And that's where the cross of Jesus comes in. Because if we see the rooted value in terms of what God is calling us to be and to do, then we are really getting into the meat of what Jesus did. And we'll get into that in a second. So what we hear on Sunday from this first lesson is basically the call of Moses. And I think it's a helpful reminder to us that each and every one of us is called into some part of God's mission. And that sometimes that call is not easily answered. And it's okay for us to ask a lot of questions, even to try to run away from it. Because if our hearts really are with God, we will never escape it. God will prevail. He prevailed over Moses. He prevailed over Isaiah. He prevailed over Jeremiah. He prevailed over Jonah and all the rest of them. And so we get down to the lesson for today, which is, or for Sunday, the gospel lesson, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit more today, which is from the 13th chapter of St. Luke, and it begins this way. At that very time, there were some present who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And he said to them, do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, that they were worse sinners than all the other Galileans? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish as they did. Or those 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them. Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did. And then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, see here, for 3 years I've come looking for fruit on this tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil? He replied, Sir, let it alone for 1 more year, until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit the next year, well and good. But if not, then you can cut it down. Here ends the lesson. Now, this particular passage has some deep meaning for me in a lot of ways, just from a experiential point of view. When I was in college, the seniors in college, we had mandatory chapel every day at the school, the college I went to. And there was a period of time where the seniors were called on to deliver the reflection, the meditation at chapel, kind of a little homily. And it wasn't, you didn't sign up, it was appointed by a rota, kind of, which is a fancy smashy term of saying, you know, your names are on a big wheel and they spin the wheel and off you come. I think, although I don't think they actually put it on a wheel or took names out of a hat or anything like that, but basically I was convinced at the time, and I still am, because the powers that be never did share this, was that I was a Catholic, small c and big C at the time. I was going to the Episcopal Church, ironically, at the time as well. And I was at Houghton College, which is a Wesleyan sponsored institution. Now, if you know the Wesleyan Church, it is quite fundamentalistic and also very evangelical. So I often wondered if they just wanted to see if I was real or not, because and maybe not even that I was real, but I do know that there were folks in leadership, both in student leadership and in the leadership of the college, that were concerned because there was a great deal of prejudice against folks like me, because I wasn't of their tribe. I wasn't a fundamentalist evangelical, and most of the students were Baptist, to be quite honest. For example, my academic advisor, when I very late my junior year into my senior year decided that I was not going forward with my academic plans, but decided to go to the seminary, immediately her response was, let's get you into the best Catholic seminary we can get you into. And she wanted to send me to Rome, because that's the prejudice, and all that, which I knew that would never happen. But I was lucky I get into the seminary at all. And they probably rue the day they admitted me anyway. But there is the notion that there were people who wanted to show that people of what we might call a more high church persuasion, liturgical churches and so on, could be Christians. The bias wasn't just that we didn't like you. It was, you're not a Christian. You're not saved. And because you do what you do, you're going to go to hell. I mean, and that was the language. And it's interesting that this was the scripture portion on which I gave my reflection. And it changed a lot of minds. And so I'm going to kind of share that bit of reflection with you. And it's about that parable at the end. It's about fertilizing the tree. This translation is very graphic. It says, calls a spade, as it were, no pun intended. And it says, I'm going to dig around it and I'm going to put manure on it. Now, I mentioned Jonah earlier, and a graphic way of painting that picture of how he was vomited onto the shore. And we've all had the experience of that. And when we're ill and we know what that's like, what the detritus of all of that is, and to be covered with all of that slime and everything else, that sometimes when God calls us into mission, it isn't a pleasant experience. And that it sometimes requires digging around our roots, which if you're a tree, now I'm going to go into literature a little bit, if I could speak Entish, I would be talking to you. Those of you who know Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, when the trees speak, they speak so slowly because, as they say, we have lots of time. So it's their roots are important. We all know about that imagery of roots. We know physically what roots are about. Roots are about nourishing and keeping life-giving substances flowing into the upper part of the plant, particularly a tree. Little known factoid about most species of trees, not all, but most, is that the root system below the ground is often fairly parallel to the branch system above the ground. So that trees' roots, strong trees that grow tall, trees' roots go very deep. And they also spread very wide. Now, Tom, you're the sort of botanical expert on this, I would think. Is that a fair assessment for the most part?
No, but
Okay.
no, I'm following what you're saying and agreeing with it.
Yeah, probably not scientifically, but at least in our experience, whenever I've tried to dig up a tree, you can never get rid of all the roots. They're just everywhere. And the idea is that even in our own system, now, George, you're the physician, you know how the brachia of the lungs and all of that. I know you're not a pulmonologist, but you do the head part. But the idea is that, we get down into the fabric of our lungs, the sacs get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the capillaries surround them so they can get as much of the life-giving oxygen that they can into the blood system, and then the heart pumps it out of the lungs and into the rest of the body. We can use all kinds of imagery about that, but this notion of this root system as the vehicle, or the pathway, let's say the pathway of life and nourishment. So you start digging around it, you run the risk of cutting roots off. So it can be a painful thing. If you're a tree, if trees were sentient, which there are some in our world who believe they are, you start digging around their root system, it's like taking a scalpel to your abdomen or your thoracic cavity, where you can cut in and cut things off and nick things that can cause deep problems. So the gardener says, I'm going to go and I'm going to take a spade and I'm going to start digging around it. You can hear the tree go like, no. And then what does he do? He brings a wheelbarrow full of, SHT and starts dumping it all over where he just spaded up and loosened the soil. Now, take that rather graphic image and then think about our spiritual lives and how often we look at God, and when God gets down and dirty, pun intended there, in digging around and manuring, fertilizing, as it were, it's not the neat and clean little bag that comes out of the, didn't have a Lowe's back in Jesus' time. Or our plain people will say that this is the best fertilizer in the world. That you start doing that in our lives, and very often we're not real happy about it. So we go back to, and we look at Moses. We look at Elijah. We look at Jonah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. And then finally we look at Jesus. And we begin to realize that the pattern of being called into mission is not sweet. It more often than not requires some deep discomfort in our lives before we can fully answer. Because what emerges from every one of those opportunities, when we look at them in Scripture, is something far better. Think of the fig tree. It was about to be cut down. The gardener comes and says, let me do this nasty thing to it. And let's see if it bears fruit. Now, we never know. We never hear it's a parable. It's a story. So it's not a factual datum, but rather a teaching. And the outside guess, well, I should say the inside guess, is that once you do that, because most of us who do have somewhat of at least a white thumb. I have a black thumb, so I try anything, nothing works. But anyone who does anything with plants and is any successful knows that when you start doing that sort of thing, it usually bears much fruit. The plant comes alive. My other half, Ken, he's amazing. We have in the garage, I'm here at the shore, in the garage, we have all these pots. He's into pot garden, not pot, but not marijuana, but pot gardening. And we have all of these clay pots everywhere of all kinds of sizes, some of which have to be moved around on a hand truck. I mean, they're that big. But what he does is he goes to Lowe's and he goes in the back or to Home Depot and he looks for the rack that has all of the dying plants on it. And usually they're deeply discounted. Something that costs $25, they'll sell you for $1.50 because it's almost dead. And it probably, and sometimes he's brought them home. I said, why did you, that's dead. He goes, no, it's not. Because he has great faith. He wouldn't say it this way, but I would. He has great faith in the roots of the plant. That what seems to be dead on the surface is really somewhere still alive because it hasn't been quote unquote dead that long. And so he will fuss and nurture and fertilize and doing just what the gardener did in this fig tree today. And it is amazing. I think of all of the plants, and there are a number of them that he's done this to, maybe he was unsuccessful in one or two that I can remember. And there have been tens, maybe 100, in the time that he's been doing this sort of mission, on a mission in some ways, to be the gardener in this particular parable, and is quite successful at it. So I can imagine that God is working with each of us somehow, even now, this Lent, because that's why we tell this story during Lent. Because this is the time when God, if we allow God to do that, will be taking that spade out and start digging around our roots. We may not like it. It may discomfort us. It may threaten us. A lot of feelings about it. And then we see the wheelbarrow coming, and a tree just can't get up and run away from the treatment. So suddenly, it's like, oh, do I have to smell that stuff? It's all there. And then eventually it all seeps down. We begin to feel stronger, slowly. A season passes, and we find ourselves in a wholly different situation than we were before. Suddenly we're looking at our branches and there are little buds and there are little bits of fruit growing. That's what Jesus is trying to teach us. That you may go in life, you may go through some very, very difficult and dire situations, which are very discomforting, bring a great deal of dis-ease. Not disease, but dis-ease about your life. But it doesn't mean that God is mad at you. It doesn't mean that God is trying to be nasty to you. Sometimes we are at a point in life where that's what we need in order to bear fruit. Because the threat, the implied threat is, if you don't bear fruit for the kingdom, I'm just going to ignore you. And if I ignore you, you will die. Well, we will all die. There's no two ways about it. But you will die in a way that you will not have borne fruit into this world of any sort. Thoughts?
But where there's life, there is hope.
Always. Always. Now, I don't want to be overly dramatic or emotional, but all we need to do is look at our television screens. There's a whole society in the world currently. There's somebody digging around their roots and they don't like it. It's not very comfortable. It's extraordinarily discomforting. It's violent, painful. What will emerge is the question. It is the way of the world. Going to the upper paragraph of that particular lesson from Luke, Jesus talks about two tragedies that were probably kind of like our news system. They were making the rounds around Galilee. Pilate, we know Pilate, the procurator of Judea, the Roman governor. He was sent there because he was particularly ruthless. He had the historical reputation of being a ruthless general. And he was sent to Judea because, even as now in a lot of ways, 'twas ever thus, there was a continual uprising happening. You know, every time they tamped something down, something else popped up. Somebody else started another rebellion. And the Roman authorities at that point in time had pretty much had it with Judea. When Herod the Great died, the one that tried to kill Jesus, the infant, you know, the Herod of the story of the Holy Innocents, the kingdom was divided into four parts. There's Herod the Tetrarch. There's Herod Antipas, which is he is now the governor, the Jewish state governor in Galilee. That's the one that Jesus just talked about last week. Tell that fox. He's the one who put John the Baptist to death. There's Philip, and then there's another one, I can't remember his name. But anyway, the kingdom was divided into four. So it wasn't a unified governmental system anymore, except under Pilate. Herod was himself ruthless, as we know. We've talked about that at Christmas time. And a megalomaniac and an egomaniac and a power-hungry, politician. And he kept control over everything. And when he died, they started to lose control, particularly as the kingdom was divided. And that's why Rome sent Pilate. Pilate was to suppress all this, make it go away. And so we hear about the rebellion of the Galileans, and Pilate has them executed. That's what the story is about. So there is a sense of political violence. The other story that Jesus refers to, other news note that Jesus brings into the teaching, is a tragic accident. That they were building a tower and the tower collapsed and many workers were killed. We might call it an accident. We could speculate on, maybe it collapsed because people were trying to cut corners and things again. We can always talk about the human value system that can cause these things. But nonetheless, there's two very different ways in which people died. And Jesus is making the point. You think either group died because God didn't like them? And Jesus says, no. It has nothing to do with it. And then he launches into this teaching. And maybe part of the teaching is about the fact that we look at the ways of the world. We look at what happens in the course of time and in our experience. And what we do have an option to do is to look at it and reflect on it carefully and to see what we can learn from it. And depending on what we learn, to allow God to use what we learn then to change the world in which we're living. So, for example, the Galileans who were slaughtered by Pilate, the lesson is not, I don't know, well, the lesson, I don't think the lesson is, don't stand up for your principles or anything like that, kowtow to the authorities. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. But he's saying as long as people try to do this kind of thing, you can expect this to happen. Don't expect God to say, oh no, you're on the side of right, so nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. However, God can use that to bring better. Same thing with the tragic workers' accident in Siloam, in Jerusalem, the Tower of Siloam in Jerusalem. Maybe then, isn't that what we try to do even in our own society? There's, remember the crane collapses of a few years ago. I know what happened in Pennsylvania was suddenly there is now, it's what Ken does for a living. He works for the Department of State in the Bureau of Professional and Occupational Administration, BPOA. And basically they're the ones who issue licenses. Everything from cosmetologists and barbers to medical licenses. And they're the ones who make sure that, well, the board, they manage the boards, and then the boards are the ultimate hearing deciders of fact, and so on, in terms of whether a license should be removed or there's a violation and there's a fine or whatever the legal system provides. And there was no such regulation of crane operators. Now there is. So that a tragic accident where tremendous damage to property and some people died and others were injured created now a whole new regimen and regime where people need to guarantee that they have the right training to minimize the possibility. It doesn't eliminate it. It doesn't eliminate it, but it minimizes. So what do we learn from tragic circumstances? Maybe that's part of what Jesus is teaching us. And in any particular case, what do we learn for the sake of the kingdom? Not just for our own safety and our own capacities, but how do we use this and reflect on how the kingdom can come about stronger, bigger, better? Any thoughts?
Isn't there another message in there that it's really saying that it really doesn't matter what the circumstances are, that whether it's something tragic or whether it's something very good, manure happens. And,
There you go. Yeah.
isn't he saying that in spite of circumstances, Christians need to be prepared?
Yes.
They need to be seeking redemption all the time, because at any time circumstances could, be borne out.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think that's a very good insight. I keep disappearing. I don't know, it's the weird lighting in my room today. I have a floating head.
I see, but I'm going the same direction, thinking as you were speaking, that I have friends who are very conservative and friends who are supposedly on the other side or the extreme side. But I have discovered there's intolerance on both sides. I mean, there's no sense of let's talk about this. And sometimes it's the digging, the learning together, the being able to hear profoundly what is it that makes you think that way or believe that way that transform us. And I tease one of my friends saying, I would never put you in the middle of Miami, because if you begin to talk, I would probably have to also pay not only for the ticket, but also for the money to get you out of jail. Because of her very rabid socialist views. And and I have a difficult time with both sides, because I see that there's this lack of, let's deepen this conversation. And probably it's a process that happened to us all the time. And we need to accept that we may be sure that we're right at any given time and convinced that these are our principles and that's it. And yet there might be other things to learn and other views to examine. Like you said about Ukraine, you hear all kinds of things, and the people in Russia are hearing a completely different view. And so the only way to get to some sense of peace is going to be if we deepen the conversation to the point of finding common ground. And that's where the kingdom comes in, where the concept of the peace of God that will include justice and peace.
Yeah, I mean, and we take that a step farther and we go, well, how do we get to that conversation? And that's sort of the digging, and as was a time you said manure happens, yeah, for example, your friend, if they're in the middle of Miami and, you start talking socialism, and you have a bunch of Cubanos around and they're gonna get after you, that may be the digging process to kind of wake you up to say, well, maybe you need to think differently, or you need to, you need to be able to grow. And I think that's part of it too, is that this is what in nature causes growth. And I think we can take it a step further about our spiritual life, and that somehow we see the necessary steps to spiritual growth as something totally different. Whether it is growth as an individual or as a community. And that, yes, the shoveling and the spading and the dumping and all of that stuff happens. And if we focus on that alone, we'll miss the bigger picture. So that we always need to have that wider horizon as to what is it that God is doing. And maybe, just maybe, this bad experience we're having is one of the necessary steps for us to grow beyond it and to get to that wider horizon soon.
I mean, I think I'm actually repeating what you just said, but I mean, I'm thinking that growth doesn't happen unless you dig down to a deeper place and you experience pain. I think in the meaningful things in my life have happened in a sense because of experiencing real pain. And if you just leave a kind of a level life, there's not much meaning there. It's kind of flat. I mean, it's just what you've been saying.
Well, there's a piece of it too, and that is risk.
Mhm.
You know, when we are not willing to risk, we can't, the adage, and I think it's way overused, no pain, no gain kind of thing. That's on every poster you see in a gym someplace. To a point, that's correct. The idea is that you need to stretch yourself just beyond your comfort zone, and that causes a slight bit of growth. And then you recoup, and then you go back and you do it again. And the idea is every time you experience just that little bit of pain, not, we're not supposed to bring pain on. That's not the point, but rather that it's that steady step of progress that we need to make. That's what growth is. Nobody grows all at once. It may seem that, you see, particularly with COVID, I've seen people, especially young ones, that I haven't seen for 2 years, and suddenly, they're a foot taller than they were the last time I saw them. And it seemed like they grew all at once. Well, they didn't. They grew steadily day by day by day by day. That's the natural process of growth. And I do find it instructive that Jesus takes so many agricultural examples, because that's what his people would have understood, and uses them to talk about the spiritual life. That the work of growing spiritually is a steady process. Now, maybe I'm biased to that. I started earlier about my experience at Houghton, because one of the differences between some of the churches is this idea that there is this dramatic conversion, the being saved idea. But even then, those that emphasize the whole sense of an altar call and this dramatic moment that you can define, that was always, they would ask, when were you saved? I would get this question. I go like, I've always had this relationship with God from the time I was growing up. It's changed. And there were these moments of crisis, perhaps, but I can't remember a moment where I, quote unquote, dedicated my life to Jesus. But, and I think that was the whole sort of agenda that I was talking about earlier, the unwritten agenda, that, there is another way of coming into relationship with God than what they had been schooled in, quite literally. And that's kind of what we do from the high church sort of liturgical perspective, is the fundamental understanding is slightly different, where we don't have this, moment that we can pinpoint on a red letter day on a calendar kind of thing. But rather it begins as children. That's why we baptize infants. And you grow day by day, cell by cell, moment by moment, spiritual experience by spiritual experience, which is why it is so critically important to bring people into a community, and why our community is so important to us, because it's in that context that we have this steady day by day growth pattern.
It coming from communities like you are describing. My bias in some ways is that there might be dramatic moments in your life, but if you don't do anything about growth, they simply are a moment.
Right.
And what I have noticed is that, and I must say that sadly, because I would like for things to be different, but I have friends who have considered that moment to be the moment and there's nothing else.
Right.
And then forget growth as a concept that we have to go through every day of our lives in some fashion.
Right.
That I think that the wisdom of the reflection at the end of the day, examine the conciencia,
Mhm.
and the tradition of examining your life at some points in and moment is probably a good thing. And what I have discovered is that when we assume that attitude, a problem can become something that God will take away from me rather than some situation in which I have to meditate and learn from, and maybe even change in myself, in my own development.
Right.
And probably I was talking to someone the last few days about a God who is like a Santa Claus that will solve it for me.
Yeah.
Or a God that is with me and in me, transforming, and like the parable says, digging around, manuring, changing, and sometimes even making us feel discomfort and pain.
Yeah.
But transforming.
And the gift that can be, for example, when we confront deep difficulty in our life, when we confront tragedy in our life, when we lose a loved one, when we lose a job or a career, or we end up being diagnosed with a chronic or serious illness, that that somehow we miss the capacity to actually learn from that situation. The difficulty with seeing the individual moment as the moment is we try to live out of that moment and keep going back to it, which doesn't propel us forward. It just forces us to look back. So Carmen, you tap on something that's very important there, and that's this notion of what we call the examine, which is a daily discipline in our lives where we actually take time. Most people do it at the end of the day. It could be at the beginning of the next day, and looking back at the day prior. What was my experience? What did I learn from it? How am I different because of it? That the examine is one of those ideas. It's not only, there's two different things and they often get conflated. They're related, but not the same. The examination of conscience, which is what we do, say, when we do the Decalogue during, like we just did on Sunday, we recite the Decalogue, and we think about those things which we have done and not done and so on. That's the examination of conscience. The examine that Carmen is referring to is an examination of consciousness, which is different. It's an examination of my awareness. And the idea is that it brings us to an awareness of where God is acting in my life. Even if that action, at the moment that it occurred, back when, earlier in the day or the day prior, makes me think that God is mad at me or whatever, what we need to do then is call it to mind in a context where we know that God is not like, that's what Jesus is trying to say. God does not do this. God loves you. And so he loves you like the gardener loves that fig tree, that he'll do everything unto the last moment to keep you from getting cut down. So, that's the question then is, what do we, and I think that's Carmen's direction with that, is what do we do with it? Those organizations that I really do fully support from an evangelical point of view do things like the Billy Graham Crusade. I don't know if you've ever been to a crusade or really kind of watch what happens. When people are called to the altar call and they have this dramatic conversion experience, the first thing that the organization does is try to shepherd you to a church community. Because the idea is not just about that moment of giving your life over to God, to Christ, but now you need this community in which you will grow in Christ. so that the community becomes one of the essential elements. It's the ground in which we grow as these trees. So that, that's the thing that we often kind of mix up, particularly in our American way of life, because we have this notion still that my religious life is between me and God and nobody else. It doesn't matter to anybody else. Well, it shouldn't matter from a judgmental point of view. What it does matter is that we're all in it to support one another, because none of us can do it alone. So, Soon, you were going to say something earlier again. Okay. All right.
No, I was thinking George was.
Oh, my George.
Are you inviting me to say something?
Yes.
Well, if you are, I'm kind of at the stage of my life where I'm looking back a whole lot more than I'm looking forward. But we are what we are by not of all the wonderful things we did, but of some pretty bad mistakes we made. And some pretty bad things that happened to us that we either learned from or did not learn from, or we grew from. And sometimes when you look back, you realize there was a moment you never even realized it that changed your life.
Mhm.
And so that what we're talking about with the fig tree is what we go through, if we're lucky, where there may be somebody there at the right time who fertilizes you just a little bit, so that you wish to be a better person, or you become it and not even know it.
Right.
And we go through these experiences, and we realize how meaningful some of them were, and perhaps we didn't realize it at the time.
Yeah. And sometimes what can happen is we kind of, particularly in our day and age, in our culture, we get this vision, we're always told we're supposed to set visions and goals, you have to have a goal for your life. You have to be, going in this direction or that direction or whatever. And you have to do everything in your power to get there and all this kind of stuff. I know in my own life, I've done that. And on more than one occasion, got knocked up one side of the head by God, none other than God, and said, no, that's not the way I want for you. And it's all church and it's all good. And it's, there's nothing bad about what I was talking about or wanting to do. But it was like, no, that's not what I'm calling you to do. And so there is sort of the Jonah experience where you get thrown off the ship and swallowed up and spit out. And you go like, oh God, just like I'm a failure. And then I once said, and Jen, you said this to me a while back, you said there's a book inside of you somewhere. And I thought about it. I said, if I did write such a memoir kind of thing, I would call it Failure. I mean, I think that's the title that I would put to it, Failure, and talk about all the times that I failed, but not because they're bad or anything bad came from it, but it was just this parable working it itself out. That it was God doing something to me that got me ready to bear more fruit, someplace else. Quite frankly, even coming to St. Luke's. I mean, I came there with the full intention that I would be there a year. Tom knows this. You can blame him. Only 50% of the blame goes to him. The other half goes to Beth Yoke. I remember sitting in the tavern. What do they call that, Tom? Harper's Tavern. And having lunch with them, being interviewed by them to be the interim rector. And I remember walking out and saying, well, that didn't go well. And I didn't expect to get a call. I honestly didn't. And I've since had conversation with them, and it went a lot better than I anticipated, obviously. And here I am 6.5 years later. with you, part of your community, part of who you are, with never having even the intent to stay, because in that context, I could not stay. And it just goes to say that when God wants something, God does it. And if it means digging and pouring manure on it, or spitting you out of a fish, or whatever it is, and working with my spiritual director and everything, I came to the conclusion, my second year with you, that this is where I belong. This is what God is calling me to do. And once I finally sort of, it's my personal spiritual journey about this, and I finally sort of gave in, as it were, just like Moses in the first lesson for Sunday, just like Isaiah we read a few weeks ago, just like Jonah and Elijah and so on. Things started to happen, and not because of me, but because it was what God wanted for this community, from all of us, and working together, and all of the sort of synergisms that emerged and the alignments that emerged. I often will say to others when I talk about the parish, I said, they were ready. We just needed some catalyst to move it forward.
Yeah.
And I think we're there again. We're still there.
I would say, similar to your experience, if I knew what being called to ministry was like, I would not have done it, because I had some ideas of how much fun I could have doing something else. And yet, even with all my questions, like Moses, and all the doubts that I had in my mind, even through seminary, I did many of my papers at the seminary dealing with some of the questions I have at that point, and saying to God all the right things why I should not be doing this. And I must say, it has not been an easy ride, but I suspect that if I had not said yes, or have been willing to say, okay, I don't understand and I don't like it, but I'll go ahead, there might not have been, not ministry, something happening to me otherwise.
Yeah.
It's more like, not just what happens in ministry, is what happens to us when we are in ministry. We begin to see the challenges, and if we have the right attitude, sometimes in that attitude of willingness to obey, or willingness to go along with God's, what we discern to be God's will at that moment, we probably would quit.
And you just hit on something that's critically important with all of this, and that is the notion of discernment. Now we're getting really deep here. This is really deep stuff. Discernment is the work in the spiritual life of hearing the call of God to mission. And all of us, by the very reason and nature of our baptism, are called into mission. Carmen was part of our class Sunday last, and we talked about this a bit. The Episcopal Church, at first blush, looks like, a very clericalized kind of organization. When we really look at it carefully, there is a lot of power, in the best sense of that term. I shouldn't say power, a lot of authority vested in the baptized, into what we call the lay folk, or the laity. It is a lay-led church, really. The clergy are given specific responsibilities, but if you look at, say, if you're into law like I am, the residual power resides with the laity. I mean, I'm looking around the screen here, and of the 6 Hollywood squares I'm looking at, take me out, there's 5. 3 of them have been wardens in the church. 4 of them, well, Soon hasn't been a warden, but I was gonna say 4 of them have been on vestry. And vestry calls the clergy. Their clergy is not sent by the bishop. The bishop, before it becomes active, the bishop must approve the call of the vestry. But the vestry calls. I mentioned the interview that I had with Tom and Beth at the time when I came as the interim, because the interim, it's a little different situation. But still, it was the wardens and their special responsibility as wardens who decided to give that name to vestry. And ultimately the vestry did call and the bishop approved. So we need to go back to that fundamental reality of our baptism to really see where authority and power resides in the church. And I don't mean that in terms of governance necessarily, but mission. Whose responsibility is it to carry out the mission of Jesus in the world? It's not the bishops and the priests and the deacons. It's the whole church. The bishops and the priests and the deacons are to organize and build up the body of Christ, to equip, as St. Paul says, to equip the saints for mission. My job as a rector, as a priest in the church, is to help everyone else find their gift and everyone else then hone their gift and provide the groundwork, the fertilized groundwork, where they can exercise that gift for the sake of the kingdom of God. That's heavy stuff. And so just what is it that I individually, not David, but Tom, Kathy, George, Soon, Carmen, Jennifer, any one of us, what are we called? I mean, I just have been in that process for 40 plus 50 years, really. And it's a continual lifelong process. It never ends. Where is God calling you? And sometimes that call is to something very discomforting. That's how we started this conversation. On the other hand, sometimes if we stick with it long enough, we find we're in a different place than we were before the call, and it's a wonderful place. It's a place of contentment and peace. And ultimately, that becomes a permanent, not to push this too far, it becomes a permanent contentment and peace when we leave this world through the portal we call death. And we find ourselves with the God who called us in the first place. And there's no longer any veil or any mask. There's no longer anything separating us from that ultimate spiritual reality. So we just get glimpses of it in this life. And that's what keeps us moving forward. And as we grow, as we expand, as we bear fruit, that's our motive to continue. That's one reason we read this now, because we're in the middle of Lent. And so our motive needs to be to continue the trek toward Easter, because it's that Easter joy that is our goal. Any final thoughts?
When do you think this will be posted?
Pardon me?
When do you think this will be posted?
It'll take a little while because it has to process at Zoom, and then I have to download it, and then I'm going to edit out the you weren't here, I had a little power failure and stuff, so I have to edit it. So it'll take a little bit, but it'll be posted probably later today or tomorrow.
Okay.
I appreciate your recording our last session because it was so good.
Thanks. Yeah, I like to record them. Some are better than others, obviously. And I put them up for a while because the page can get overwhelmed with recordings.
Yeah.
So I just kind of keep 2 or 3 more current ones up. Yeah, but I hope you found where they are. They're on
Yeah.
that Christian Formation website. There are links to them all through, all of our websites and things, because the whole idea is to get more people to understand what we're doing here, and hopefully we have a full house today. That's great. And just, it's great. Kathy, are you not on daylight saving time or?
No, I'm on standard time. I made it to my Zoom class. I made it to Deidre's class on time. I was there. I knew what I was doing.
Okay, all right. Because you
I
came in at
was the
11.
only one in the Caribbean doing that.
Okay, all right. All right. Well, thanks,
But we
everybody.
were I was kind of lazy this morning.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, well, you missed
we
the
did
part
get
about
apricot
digging around your roots.
We got some apricot croissants and fresh pineapple for breakfast.
Oh my God. Oh, tough life, I'll tell you.
I know.
Yeah, of course, I'm saying that's while I'm sitting at the shore, but again, that's why the fuse blew, because my little office is in the basement, which is quite chilly because there's no heating in the basement except for these little space heaters I have, and I had them on a little too high.
Oh,
And we went to battery power on the computer, so I didn't lose everybody, but I had to run off and try to put it all back together. All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for being here this morning. We'll see you again. Just a reminder, on Sunday, we have instructed Eucharist for the first part of service, Liturgy of the Word. And then next week, for the 4th Sunday of Lent, we will have the instructed Eucharist for the second part of the service. So kind of expect it to be a slightly little different. Mother Mary has the 5 o'clock service this week for those of you who are interested. And she's preaching, as I mentioned, and she's planning to preach on the Exodus lesson. So that's why we talked about that a little bit at the beginning, and then we'll go from there. So we'll see you all. Take care. Everything continues. We'll see you. Be well.
enjoy yourself.
Thank you.